We look at autobiography, fiction, memoir, etc. They are a genre. You will hear me use the term enslaved narratives, and that is a statement of theological anthropology. You will hear me go in between slave and enslaved because I want to honor the tradition where it appears in text, but outside of tradition or direct quotes, you will hear me use the term enslaved narrative, and that is a statement of theological anthropology. What do I mean by that? I mean, I understand that no human being is inherently born a slave. Contra Aristotle and Gaius and Philo, right? We can look at ancient philosophers and even some patristic fathers. Contra them, no person is inherently a slave. People are enslaved by other people who are enslavers. And so I use that term to honor the humanity of the people who have been enslaved. Early book-length narratives, in terms of the genre of the slave narrative, served as an apology for anti-slavery efforts. And you will find, as we were reading Frederick Douglass, this week, those of us who are in the seminar, we were reading Charlotte Fortin, that as a genre, oftentimes the main goal of their writing was to serve abolitionist efforts. And so you will find that, Frederick Douglass writes quite eloquently, right? And I'm using that as a distinction contra another category of enslaved narratives, or what some would call raw testimonies or raw narratives. Right, enslaved testimonies or narratives are the work, another category, of the Federal Writers Project, part of the New Deal administration. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as part of the New Deal programs and projects, an attempt to get the country back on track economically, he established these programs and these projects to help restore American prosperity, to get people employed. And so the Federal Writers Project was established and created employment for teachers, writers, librarians, clerks, researchers, editors, and historians who were unemployed as a result of the Great Depression. And so as a result, there were over 2,300 first-person interviews that were conducted by those who were hired for the Federal Writers Project. Now, one must be careful to attend to the complications and the complexities, I don't want to problematize that, but complications and complexities that enslaved narratives and testimonies do bring. So I want to talk about some cautions. It is not that they should not be used as primary sources. I mean, that we will find in our conversation that there were times when enslaved narratives were not considered valuable primary sources. The veracity of those sources was questioned. And so we use them. They're an excellent source of history, et cetera, but there are some cautions and methodological approaches to which we must attend. And so some sources. From 1927 to 1935, 3 universities, Fisk University, Southern University, and Kentucky State University. Among these 3 universities, and working independently, researchers at these 3 universities collected the oral histories of over 700 formerly enslaved persons. Another source, again, we talked about the Federal Writers Project of the Work Project Administration under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The third source that many people don't know about is a dissertation written in 1964 by Marion Wilson Starling. And his dissertation contained sources of judicial papers, broadsides, private printings, abolitionist newspapers and volumes, church records, journals. Marion had over, I believe it was 6,000 records and entries in the dissertation. And so these are some primary, there are others, there are myriad others. You can look at works by John Blassingame, and we have lots of enslaved narratives that we can pull and cull information from. Now, here are some of the challenges when it comes to using enslaved narratives. Scholars considered recorded testimony of formerly enslaved people as unreliable historical record. I hope what is obvious must be stated, that part of the reason why the historical record of enslaved narratives was questioned in terms of its veracity and value was the source of the information. So let's just make that clear, right? So there was problem. The challenges was that enslaved narratives were not always considered academic scholarship. That's the first thing. Secondly, white readers questioned the authenticity of enslaved narratives because they didn't believe that Black Americans were capable of writing and telling their own story. And so when we see the response, when we see the titles as written by himself or herself, that is a response. That is a polite response to say, yes, I did write it. Yes, it is by my own hand. Just like Paul said, I write this with my own pen, written by himself or herself. Another challenge of the use of enslaved narratives of primary source material is that this tension between truth revealed and truth obscured, the interiority of the enslaved people's lives versus the political conditions under which they were produced. In this regard, the writing of enslaved narratives and the condition under which African Americans, people in the African diaspora live in this country, are similar in that there's always a tension between what's happening on the inside with people of African descent and the judicious dissemination of how much we can say in personal and public arenas. So there's always the tension. And so if we recognize that tension, we must read the text with a lens to ask, what are they not saying? Right? So you read what's on the page, but you also question what didn't get on the page. And so here, again, some more challenges, and we can go through those quickly, to using enslaved narratives. They served an abolitionist agenda, and so when something is written with a particular agenda, there are ways in which language is used to construct arguments, et cetera, and so one must weigh that. Autobiographies were published independently and often without a primary political purpose. So conversely, there was a question about whether they could be used as valuable resources because it doesn't have an agenda. So what's its purpose? It's funny we don't question the purpose of other autobiographies, but these came under scrutiny. Multiple versions, as we have seen this week, of autobiographical narratives offering both contradictory and evolving accounts of the same life story. And Dr. Gibson did a fine job explaining to us, right, how that unfolds and people's agendas at different stages in their life. Biographies by white authors on Black subjects. The challenge with using those is sometimes they reveal more about the author than the subject, and the biases of the one recording the person's history could overshadow or contradict a person's actual history. There were what I call literary ventriloquists, white ghostwriters for formerly enslaved persons. In the same way, multiple narratives written by a white biographer. So there's two different categories of this rewriting or these multiple tellings of the same story. And there are different challenges that attend whether the writing is white or Black. Finally, hybrid narratives, right? Narratives that are a blend of autobiography and fiction with unclear lines between the actual and the imagined. Again, this does not discount the value or veracity of it, but it does invite us to methodological attention to how we handle these resources. So, challenges of using enslaved testimony. And we're going to see the difference when we begin to look at some of these enslaved narrative snippets. We will see that the language is very different. It is quite colloquial. It is not as fine and polished as Douglas or Fortin. Formerly enslaved persons were interviewed by those people who were hired from the government. Franklin Delano Roosevelt employed these teachers and these librarians and these researchers who were white to interview formerly enslaved people who were Black. I think we see the challenge. Not only from the racial perspective, but also people of African descent had a long and valid history of distrust of the government, right? So it is an exponentially complex challenge in using these. There was the argument, and some would make it today, that the adult recollections of childhood experiences are questionable. We can't quite be sure we can rely on them to be telling the truth, right? Testimonies influenced by oral culture and other influences over time. Some would argue that that reduces or eradicates the value and veracity of the testimony, and that is simply not true. Then there's also the challenge of the cultural distance and biases of white interviewers. Just how can they attend to that? Now, programmatically, part of the way that the program, the Federal Writers Project, was intended to combat that was researchers were given a list of questions. They were told how to ask the questions. They were told how to follow up. And even with those protocols, the human subjectivity that's involved in that does come into play. And so it does raise a question. And again, this does not eliminate the veracity or the value of the narratives, but it does give us a place from which to start to exercise certain kinds of methodological and research to handle that gingerly. And so most of all forms of enslaved narratives are some forms of mediated testimony. It's a mediated story of the enslaved person. So I want to look at some actual narratives, right, on a few of the rites of the church, not all of them, just a few, and to begin to walk through and look at what we glean. And why do I use primary sources? Because we have a plethora of secondary sources. I mean, Rabbitoh, we've got tons, we've got Cernet, we've got lots of witnesses and secondary sources about the slaveocracy. But I think it's important to look at the details of the person themselves, to let the person tell their own story so that we can take this journey together. So, baptism, the entrance rite of the church. Let's look at these two texts, one by Reverend Elijah Mars and another by Mr. Hamp Kennedy. You will find that in these narratives, I put an honorific on the names of the enslaved. Sometimes it appears in the text, sometimes it does not. I put an honorific, and if I've missed one, please bring it to my attention, but I put an honorific on there because enslaved people were so dehumanized and robbed of their dignity. That is my way of giving dignity to the ancestors, by giving them the Mr., the Mrs., the Sir. It is a way to dignify the ancestors. So let's look. Long slide. I don't expect you to read all this tiny print, maybe just the highlights. Right? But this will look like a familiar process to you. Right? Instruction, teaching. One of my masters, just going to read the highlights. He, being a Christian, took me by the hand and told me I was a sinner and that Jesus Christ died to save sinners. And all I had to do was believe that Jesus Christ was able to save. I prayed the best I could after I left him. I prayed during the week, and I had a special place to pray every morning. When I went after the cows about a mile under the juniper tree, Sunday came, and I went to church and heard Brother James preach from the text, "Escape for your life." I was struck with conviction and lingered until Reverend Charles Wells, who was then the pastor of the Colored Baptist Church, Simpsonville, commenced a protracted meeting. Shortly after the commencement of the meeting, I professed my faith. Then came time to be baptized. It was extremely cold, and the streams covered with ice an inch thick. I had to again ask permission to be baptized. And with tears in their eyes, my request was granted. Anyone familiar with liturgical history will hear echoes of this wonderful staple document that we have that is called the apostolic tradition that is attributed to Hippolytus. And so we look at some plot points on here, and we see what? We see evangelism, right? That this took him by the hand and told him he was a sinner. And he needed Jesus. And he went away and prayed. And if you know anything about this ancient tradition and the apostolic tradition, that there's a time period, right, this period of evangelization before one makes the commitment to Christ. So there are these liminal periods. And so we see the liminality in this text. And shortly after his meeting, he professed Christ. And at the beginning of the Lenten season, the names of those to be baptized are recorded. So he professed his faith in Christ. But he says, I had to ask permission again to be baptized. Now, the text doesn't tell us this. He had to ask permission to be baptized. Presumably, he's at the water, because he said the water is extremely cold, which if you read old dirty documents, the Didache talks about water prescriptions, if it's not fresh, if it's not running, if it's hot or cold. Right? So it's cold water. And so there's a way in which there's an allusion to having to make some kind of confession of faith at the water, right? And so and part of what is important to me about letting the primary source texts speak is because in the work I've done and in the hallways I've traveled, there is a thought among certain groups, denominationally and ethnically, that black people don't have liturgy, that we have low liturgical form. And so part of reading these texts is to say that, first of all, there are patterns and practices that we've carried, and we'll get to that because the African American tradition doesn't start in America but in Africa, and we'll talk about that shortly. But also to see that this is a pattern that is shared by the whole church. So now we get this distinction, right? So we have this general confession which kind of looks Romans 8, 6-ish, 10-ish, right? But now we have Mr. Kennedy who is saying, now his context is Presbyterian. And see, we had prayer meetings in each other's houses during the week. One plantation owner built a little church on his place, and the Negroes, they go in the back door and sit in the back. And the white folks, they come in the front of the church and sit. The Presbyterian church was the only one around there, and they sprinkled everybody. Just poured water over the people's head with a glass and then patted them on the head. They ain't use a whole lot of water than Presbyterians. Right, but this was his experience. And so, and I didn't say this, but there's also a way I don't want us to universalize the experience. Just as in the ancient church, just as anywhere, no experience is universal, but we begin to see patterns as we look at the text. And so he says, them Presbyterians didn't use a whole lot of water. Right, but we see, right, that there's a common right that we share. There's a common practice that we share as Christians. I often say when I teach class, when I teach worship class or when I teach occasional services, I said there's two things that every church does. We got to give them a bath and we got to feed them. Now, we may vary on how we give them a bath and we may vary on how we feed, but we got to give them a bath and we got to feed them, right? And then all of our other rights fall out of there. So now I want to look at a marriage right, right? The two become one flesh sometimes. And so I want to look at one marriage right. Right? So Mr. Kennedy again, right, tells us this story about jumping the broom, a practice that is often found in African American communities, and there's some current research that would suggest that the practice was imported from Europe. More to be done on that. But for Mr. Kennedy, who was in Mississippi, or depending on where you're from, you say Mississippi, we had about 60 slaves on our place. And if a Negro man on one plantation fall in love with a slave girl on another, they just come to her plantation and jump the broom, and then they's married. If the girl don't love the boy and he jumped the broom and she didn't, then they ain't married. Didn't always go well. Sometimes the brothers had to take their broom back. I'm real sorry, brothers. But wasn't no wedding. Right, but but even you see, like even in the midst of this oppression, right, that there is still some agency. Right, when enslavers control lives and governments control lives, and some guy said, "Oh, she mighty cute," and he was like, "You and your broom." Right, so even the places where people can snatch agency, and for a black woman, that's huge. I feel sorry for the brother, but that's huge for him. Right, so that's one marriage right. I want to look at funeral rites, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. A funeral rite as witnessed in one enslaved narrative. We go to Mr. Kennedy again. He had a lot to say. But here is something I've never heard. Jimmy, I don't know if you've even heard of this. You may have heard of this. It says when a Negro died, we had a wake, and that was different from what is done today. Right, so there's a testament to this evolutionary practice of the wake. And at the wake, we clapped our hands and kept time with our feet. Right? But this wake process, this wake event, was called Walking Egypt. I'd never heard of that. It's odd, right? That's what they call it, Walking Egypt. And we chant and hum all night till the Negro was funeralized. So what's fascinating about this is that this is one of the earliest distinctions we see of these two separate processes, right? We have a wake and we have a funeral, but what's interesting is they sit vigil, right? And they sit all night, and that the funeral is not thought to be complete until they've gone through the night. Now, you can hear allusions of dying and rising, right? This is a night on which our Lord passed from death, right? All of these allusions. But you get this vigil. In the I don't know what year it is, right? And they chant and they hum. And now, I don't know, but what are the questions that go off in the liturgical head? We had a wake, and that was different from what is done today. So this wake is different from other wakes. But at the wake, they clap their hands and they keep time. Do they not clap at the funerals? Like, how is the funeral different from the wake in terms of music? That's a question. I don't know. Mr. Kennedy does not say. But it's interesting that we get this wake called Walking Egypt, and we get a vigil. We get a vigil. Now, Mr. Charles Emery Stevens writes about Anthony Burns. Now, Anthony Burns was a fugitive enslaved person, and Charles Stevens thought that his life was worth preserving. And Stevens writes that the material for this autobiography on Anthony Burns was derived from original sources, and that much of it is narrated, and I myself was an eyewitness. And so he thought this man's life and story was worth telling, and he wrote it down. He said, in this, the preacher's new capacity, it sometimes fell to his lot to perform the marriage rite for slaves, or what among them was called such, and sometimes to conduct the burial service for the dead. If a slave died during the week, no funeral was allowed to interrupt the daily toil of the plantation. The body, encased perchance in an orange box, was deposited in the ground without ceremony or delay, and a few shovelfuls of earth were thrown in, while the bereaved kindred went about their toil as usual. But on the following Sabbath, the whole body of slaves, attended by their master or overseer, assembled to sod the grave with prayers, exhortations, and much singing of hymns in the sad, wild Negro airs. This final ceremony was completed. Right, so again, no practices are universal, but the death of an enslaved person was not enough to cause anybody to stop working. Care if that was your son, your husband, your wife, your daughter. Doesn't matter. You work. We'll take care of the immediate health issues and sanitizing concerns in terms of the disposition of the body. But the community said, you will not stop us from remembering and celebrating this life. And so what do we see? Sod the grave. Now I'm curious about that. I don't know what that is. I wonder what that means. I don't know. But they sang, and exhortations. What were they exhorting each other to do, I wonder? Much singing of hymns. And again, like the earlier narrative we looked at, this completes the ceremony. So for the enslaved person, even though they were bound and had prescriptions on their time and when they could move and when they can celebrate and when they can observe and when they can mourn, what they did not let enslavers do was dictate when the service was over for their loved one. This for them was the end. Isn't that interesting? Couldn't hear nobody pray. Praying and singing as witness in enslaved narratives. Now, if you've got a musical ear, you'll be attentive to the pun in me using that. We sing that, couldn't hear nobody pray, way down yonder by myself, and I couldn't hear nobody pray. But for the enslaved, they couldn't let people hear them pray. And so there's an inversion that has to happen, because sometimes to be heard praying would cost you your life. There was one narrative in which one enslaver says, "You don't have time to serve God. You're here to serve me." When they heard him praying, because he was their master. Let's look at, she was unnamed, and I couldn't shake the title of her essay. I can't forgive her the way she used to beat us. But this is what she said about praying. And what I found, and there are some narratives that talk about praying, and there's some talk about singing, and they didn't have enough heft for examination, or it might have been a light passing, but places where there was something to be mined, praying and singing went together. North African Bishop Augustine of Hippo says, it's attributed to him, we don't know, but it is attributed to North African Bishop Augustine that the one who sings prays twice. Brian Wren borrowed that for the title of his book, Praying Twice. And so this woman who chose to be unnamed, said many times Negroes in them days turned the pot up and prayed and sung in the pot to keep the white folks from hearing them. Our white folks, when they have camp meetings, would have all the colored come up and sing over the mourners. They still say that the colored can beat the white folks singing. Right? But now I want to talk about this practice called singing in the pot or singing in the bowl. Right? Ancestors would take a metal pot, and this pot, because they were enslaved people, had to do double, triple duty. They would cook in it, they'd wash their clothes. But what they would do is they would take the pot and turn it over, and they would lower their voices, and they would sing and pray in the pot, because the pot would catch the sound, it was thought, and that enslavers would not hear, and the overseer would not hear. And so in some churches that you will find, some very more Afrocentric churches that try to incorporate the history of the ancestors, you will see, what's that big metal pot up there? That's homage to the ancestors, because we couldn't let people hear us pray, because it might cost somebody their life. And recently at an ordination service, Jimmy was actually in Atlanta, a woman was ordained, and part of the ritual of her ordination, her pastor invited her to pray in the pot, so that only God can hear your prayers, right? And so you will find in many enslaved narratives this tradition of praying or singing in the pot or the bowl. And so singing and praying came at the time with mourners. And it brings to mind, if anyone has any kind of familiarity with Jewish ritual or mourning practices, that oftentimes mourners are called in or brought in to help the community and the family grieve. Now, Sister Kelly said, well, we used to have a little singing and praying like good old time revival. So now we get this notion of revival, right? We start to hear the revival movement ancestors, if you will. And we would take pots, and put them right in the middle of the floor to keep the sound in the room. To keep the white folks from meddling. Yes, and the sound would stay in the room after you do that. Well, we always used to use those old wash pots like you boil clothes in. Just turn one down in the middle of the floor, and that's sufficient. And so that was a prayer practice. That was common prayer practice in those days. Now, praying and singing. Miss Fannie Moore from North Carolina. The white folks afraid to let children learn anything. They afraid they get too smart and be harder to manage. They never let them know anything about anything. Never have any church. If you go sit in the back of the white folks' church, but the Negroes slip off and pray and hold prayer meeting in the woods, and they turn down the big wash pot and prop it up with a stick to drown out the sound of them singing. I remember some of the songs we used to sing. One of them went like this. Hark from the tomb a doleful sound, my ears hear a tender cry. A living man come through the ground, where we may shortly lie. Here in this clay may be your bed, in spite of all your toil. Let all the wise bow reverent head, must lie as low as ours. Resurrection theology, the tomb. No matter what you do, this is going to be your bed. And let all the wise bow reverent head, must be as low as ours. I want to talk about some traditions that have been imported from Africa and want to move to music, which is the larger part of our time together. I want to talk about orality and music and performance in African traditional religions, right? African culture is largely oral. To say that it is largely oral, it would be a mistake to say that it is not there's not written language as well. If you study Ethiopia, you know in Ge'ez there are lots of liturgical and holy sacred scriptures and texts. So though we need to understand that the oral tradition in Africa ran parallel to and not in place of a written tradition. And the orality was a mode of communicating. We think about the griot. We talked about ancestors. We talk about deity as a way of communicating history, talking about local politics. They were an oral community, and so storytelling was not an unusual phenomenon for them. It was part of their community. They accomplished it through communication, through stories, through song, praise, face-to-face. There were all of these different modalities of communications that did not get lost in the transatlantic journey. That did not get lost. Okay, so the rich oral history, it should be noted, exists alongside a rich written history. And again, I must emphasize that that did not get lost. Why am I leaning on that? Because there is narratives that, when they brought the Africans to the New World, we had to give them religion. We had to teach them how to. No, you did not. In fact, if we study history, we will realize that Christianity went to Africa and it was coming back to America, to the New World, if you will, right? And so we need to really spend some time looking at the transatlantic maps in terms of commerce and religion and ideas and theology. So, rich oral history. So now John Rabowski, who was a musician and he was a freelance journalist, he writes that the African music that enslaved Africana people brought with them had 5 characteristics. There were 5 things that marked the music that the enslaved brought with them from the continent. It was spontaneous, right? There was a way in which it was organic. It came up from among the people. It was spontaneous. It had a particular kind of melodic structure and a particular kind of harmonic structure. I defer to my musicians for greater exposition on that. It was rhythmic, and that it served as a means of communication as well. There were stories that were told. There was information that was communicated in the music. So, in his book, Black in America, is John Rabowski's book, 1971. So I want to look at singing some new songs in strange lands. Familiar text, Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for song, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing in a strange land? How can we sing if we are in bondage? How can we sing? And the testimony on the other side of the Atlantic from Mr. Jacob Branch says the folks in the big house would come down to the quarters on Saturday nights and make us sing on what was supposed to be their few moments of free time. Sing something. Entertain us. How can we sing our song? Dr. Abington, you and I were having that conversation. What do you sing? When do you sing? And how do you sing? Make us sing. They did not have a choice always. In looking at these enslaved narratives and looking at the music of enslaved narratives, I've noticed 4 categories. There's one category of song that seem to be ancestors or versions of what we now know as arranged spirituals. There's another category that looks like it's almost verbatim text of a spiritual. There are some that are just unfamiliar or unpopular texts, if you will. And then there are texts that blend 2 or more motifs, be they biblical, existential. And so I want to look at 2 in the first 2 categories. Miss Fanny Gibson in Georgia, it was a song that used to sing, going home to live with the Lord, going home soon in the morning, going home soon in the morning, going home soon in the morning. I was going home to live with the Lord. In the morning soon, in the morning soon, I was going home to live with the Lord. Sounds like soon I will be done. Right? With the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world. Going home to live with God, the repetition, the motif, right? So it seems like that's an ancestor to something that we've sung, right? So when we think about arranged spirituals, and Dr. Abington, I'm going to refer to you to correct me on this. When we think about arranged spirituals, we can't think of them, and we'll talk about this in a little while, we can't think of them as creations that someone has made post-slavery, right? That there's a way in which we think of them that they must have had some ancestor in the enslaved community, that they've come out of the enslaved experience. Would that be correct? Okay. Right, another one, right, the second category, right, a version of it. And this is something that Miss Molly Williams remembered her mother singing. Let me nigh by my cry, give me Jesus. You may have all this world, but give me Jesus. Dark midnight was my cry. Dark midnight was my cry. Dark midnight was my cry. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all this world. Give me Jesus. Right? So we see these ancestors, right, and these other versions. Right now, it must be remembered or known that enslaved persons were allowed to sing in 3 areas on a plantation: in the fields, in a brush arbor or a hush harbor, or the quarters in which they lived. Now, someone asked a question, and I think it's worth repeating for the larger audience. They said, what's a brush harbor or a hush harbor? I've never heard of it. A brush arbor, and depending on the sources that you read, you will either see brush arbor or hush harbor. They are outdoor open spaces that the enslaved would make to worship. Their roofs were covered with leaves and thatches, and they had these, it might have been tree trunks. They made these like scaffolds, I'm having word retrieval, but right, these sticks that you can put in the ground. And they made this outdoor worship space. And they were called brush arbors or hush harbors. You will find references to it in Rabbitoh. I can send it to anyone who wants to read it. Some enslaved persons were forbidden to sing anywhere. Period. Full stop. Others were allowed to sing in one or two places based on the dictates of the enslavers. But even with all of the prescriptions around singing, it never stopped the enslaved from singing. So we're just going to look at some testimonies about how the subversive spiritual enslaved person still sang. And remember, Augustine said, the one who sings prays twice. Mr. Clark said, my boss didn't allow us to go to church or to pray or to sing. If he catched us praying or singing, he'd whip us. He whipped us. He better not catch you with a book in your hand either. Didn't allow it. Don't know what the reason was, just meanness, I reckon. And that was just a reality, that some enslaved people were not permitted to sing or to pray. I want to look at the content and function of music in enslaved context. We're going to watch a clip from the movie Harriet. Cynthia Erivo and Terrence Blanchard wrote this song, the Goodbye Song, it is called. I want you to pay attention to the content of the song and what happens in the song. The song has 4 functions. We notice that the overseer's looking for Harriet. Number 1, and let's think about the words. When Pharaoh's chariot comes, I'm going to leave you. Bound for the promised land, I'm going to leave you. Sorry, I'm going to leave you. Farewell, oh farewell, but I'll meet you in the morning. Farewell, oh farewell. It serves 4 functions. The first function is it alerts the community that Harriet is about to take another trip. There's about to be another underground railroad trip. When that Pharaoh's chariot comes, I'm going to leave you. The overseer is looking for Harriet. So it's an alert that she is about to take another trip. The second function is Harriet alerts her mother of her intention to come back to and for her. I'm going to leave you. I'm sorry I'm going to leave you, but I'll meet you in the morning, right? It's not goodbye, it's a farewell. The third function of that song is it provides the community, and particularly her mother, in sung response to bid Harriet farewell. And so they echo back and repeat and pick up the chorus. And the fourth function, which some may say is the most important function, but certainly it is of particular weight, is that it confuses the overseer and it provides Harriet cover to get out, because now he can't discern where the sound's coming from, because the community has joined together, and so it disables his ability from discerning her direction and thus her location. Now, with respect to the content, the content uses 2 different Hebrew Bible deliverance scenes, which may seem like a conflation, but in a way there is a complementarity to them in terms of its liminality and the progression of the movement from bondage to freedom. The first one is Pharaoh and his chariots, which places the people in deliverance at the Red Sea. But then she says she's bound for the promised land on the other side of the Jordan, right? So in between those 2 narratives, there's a liminality between the wilderness and the free state, between the Red Sea and the Jordan. And I don't know if this was Erivo and Blanchard's intention or if they had a theological consultant with the music, I don't know, but it parallels in some ways, mirrors the liminality of Harriet moving from enslavement, but not yet arriving to freedom, right? But also the larger liminality of the repeated trips that she takes back, right, to go back and free them. So there is a kind of liminality between the 2 deliverance motifs in the song. So it's got at least 4 functions, and there's 2 points, 2 dialogical points, 2 complementary points that have this moment of liminality in between them. And that is often the way that song functioned communally, right? When they would sing Go Down Moses, or all the other spirituals that Jimmy can rattle off far better than I, but there were songs that communicated when there was going to be another freedom trip, that when the overseer, when there was danger, right? That even there were songs that directed them when to move and how, what time of day. And so going back to Rabowski, hearkening how the songs were communicating messages. That was a huge part of the music function in enslaved communities. Dwight Hopkins writes about Black theology, slave communities and Black theology. Jimmy, I think we read this for your seminar. And he says that the singing word, particularly the spirituals, the unique religious songs originating in the African American enslaved community, offered a spontaneity in creation leading toward Black psychological wholeness, part of the dynamic to take care of oneself. There was content in enslaved, music of the enslaved community, spirituals, etc., which were self-affirming, right, which spoke to their own wholeness, oftentimes in theological terms, but it was a way of taking care of their own soul. And he says, similarly, in the surreptitious gatherings of the enslaved African-American worship, Black chattel proclaimed three things: their faith, their predicament, and their hope. So Miss Susan Snow, in this particular narrative, one of the things we get is, at least in this community, there was a regular song that was sung at the funeral liturgy, right? So we get a sense of these staples in liturgical practice. The young folks used to make up a heap of songs then. They composed their own songs and sing them. I will never forget one song they sung when they buried anybody, right? So that gives us this sense of liturgical rhythm. And it went like this: my mother prayed in the wilderness, my mother prayed in the wilderness, and then I'm a-going home. Then I'm going home, then I'm going home. We'll all make ready, Lord, and then we're going home. She pleaded her cause in the wilderness, in the wilderness, in the wilderness. She pleaded her cause in the wilderness, and then I'm going home. Speaking to the existential state of their reality in the wilderness, in this enslavement in a country not their own. They're going to plead their case in the wilderness. And you hear Jesus is praying in the wilderness as a biblical allusion behind that. And then they are going home. Dwight Hopkins also says that the sacred power of the singing word, the divine gift of potent song, emanated from loftier heights of a sacred horizon. Thus, the revelation of divine lyrics and holy rhythm implanted in the aesthetic harmonizing of beautiful dark tongues signified the co-laboring exertion of God and humanity in the reconfiguring of the Black self. African American servants knew about themselves and how to take care of themselves. There is also a way in which enslaved Africans also understood that the content of their songs, the words, were not strictly the composition or the imagination or creation of them themselves, but understood it to be divinely given. And so there was a co-laboring relationship between God, the divine, and the enslaved in the composition and construction of what they sang. Mr. Jacob Brand says, I used to know lots of spiritual songs, but can't recollect them now. Spiritual songs, they come through visions. Right, so there is this understanding, this existential, experiential understanding that God speaks to us, right? And that the content of my songs is not just the content of my imagination, but it is in this relationship that we have with God. Reverend Reed says some of the old slaves composed the songs we sing now. God revealed it to them. So there is this divine connection, not only with them existentially, but even in how they sing and support themselves in community. Mr. Elijah Cox, forget now and forgive has always been my guide. For that's what the Golden Scripture says. But my memory will turn around back to when I was tied down, and for them will weep and mourn. For our souls were not our own in those agonizing, cruel days, slavery days. And so part of sometimes they are singing their own existential experiences as well. Now, Mr. Rensford Hangs says, you asked me about them old songs the slaves used to sing. Well, I don't remember them. After surrender, that gives us context. We know that this is around the end of the Civil War. After surrender, all the old slaves who stayed on the plantation around Gainesville used to gather at the landing and wait and see the steamboats pull in from down the Tabigby on their way to Columbus, Mississippi, and start singing a song. Here's one I heard my mama sing so much that I learned it. Read the Bible and understand Methuselah was the oldest man. He lived 969, then died and to heaven in the Lord's due time. Methuselah was a witness for my Lord, for my Lord. Read in the Bible and understand Samson was the strongest man. Went out to battle to fight one time, killed 1,000 of the Philistines. Samson was a witness for my Lord, for my Lord. Daniel was a Hebrew child. Went to the Lord and prayed a while. The Lord told the angels the lines to keep, so Daniel laid down and went to sleep. And that's another witness for my Lord, for my Lord. But now Mrs. Fannie Berry, she might have been one of the happiest souls to be free. She said the color regiment came up behind, and when they saw the color regiment, they put up the white flag. You remember before this red or bloody flag was up. Now, do you know why they raised that white flag? Well, honey, that white flag was a token that Lee had surrendered. Glory, glory. Yes, the child, the Negroes are free. And when they knew that they were free, oh, baby, they began to sing, Mammy, don't you cook no more. You are free. You are free. Rooster, don't you crow no more. You are free. You are free. Oh, hen, don't you lay no more eggs. You are free. You are free. And I think if Miss Fannie Berry had more time, she would tell the dogs not to bark, the cats not to meow. She was going to free everybody. But look at the intensity of what liberation does. When you get free, you want everything else to be free. And notice that she starts to free things in the natural world. Everybody, you free. James Cone, speaking about the spirituals, says there can be no black theology which does not take seriously the black experience, a life of humiliation and suffering. This must be the point of departure of all God talk that seeks to be black. And that the message of liberation in the spirituals is based on the biblical contention that God's righteousness is revealed in deliverance of the oppressed, Mrs. Berry, of the shackles of human bondage. Enslaved couldn't always pray out loud. They couldn't always sing out loud. But Reverend Squires Jackson says it's interesting to know that slaves on this plantation were not allowed to sing when they were at work, but with all the vigilance of the overseers, nothing could stop those silent songs of labor and prayers for freedom. And Miss Millie Ann Smith from Texas said, the white folks had a church 4 or 5 miles off the place. Precious little we went, as Master Trammell's folks only went on big meeting days. We slipped off and had prayer meetings and prayed for ourselves, but darndest let the white folks know about it. We hummed our religious songs in the field while we was working. It was our way of praying for freedom. Thank you. Ooh, We are grateful for your kindness, and we open up the floor for questions or comments. Nicole.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. In today's worship services, we might see that we're often searching for what's common, right? In a multicultural setting, what do we have that's alike? I'm wondering then, how does the disqualifying nature of one story impact how we worship today?
Tell me what you mean by disqualifying nature of one story.
So at the beginning of the presentation, one could not hold their own narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds very similar to some of the things that we're dealing with today.
Mm.
So how has your research or your impact with worshiping communities talk about honoring the integrity of one story?
That's a good question, and thank you for it. How does one handle one's narrative? I think there was a question that came up yesterday, and I think I went on a bit of a jag, but I want to pull a thread from that to respond to your question. There are presuppositions that we bring to the worship enterprise theologically. If we hold that everyone is made in the imago Dei, right, and we honor all of these things, right, intentional worship planning would say that we need to plan in a way that people can see their story and see themselves in it. And so it is not for the worshiper to fight their way in, but rather for the worship planners and leaders to be attentive to those that are in their space. And I would say, if you are of healthy ego and disposition, that you invite those people to the table. I believe in worship planning teams, particularly in diverse, ecumenical, denominational, et cetera, ethnic contexts. So I think it's a planning matter. Because in many communities, the laity does not have the agency or the authority to change liturgy, to inform liturgy. And as one who has pastored, that's a pastoral stewardship issue. Because liturgy, I think, is a pastoral enterprise, pastoral small p. Jeremiah. Certainly.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa. Good brief. It was awesome. I appreciate it.
Bless God. We were grateful.
Question, something you mentioned in terms of the African lineage of Christianity. You kind of like...
I breezed past it, right. Yeah.
I'm interested in that. I don't know if you could share just a little bit more on that, on like maybe the timeline or the geographical direction. And then my second question, comment, and answer as you wish. If you could go back to the slide about the sacredness of words, I just wanted to see that. Yeah, that was it. But that's my second. And the other African.
Oh, okay. The first question, yeah, that's a big question. Let me try to answer it with some points in my head. In African cosmology, right, in African thought, there is no what we call bifurcation, division. There is no sacred and secular. That's the first thing, right? And in the way that the West thinks of a person has died and they're gone, and we're waiting to go, there is a way in which in African thought and cosmology, we are still in communion with the ancestors, right? And so there's a system of thought that stands different from Western thought and theology, one. Two, when Christianity came to the continent, right, people were like, well, why would they be Christian? Like, what? Like, that doesn't make sense. Did that displace their African traditional religions? Because in African cosmology, there are lots of connection points to Western theology, it was easy for some African traditional religions to adapt and integrate. Some would call it syncretism. I don't want to go there because that would suggest something different. But there was a way that there was integration that made it possible for them, right? And that's why in some contexts, not all, and I'm not saying this is a statistical universality, but in some contexts, you will find it's easy for Africans to become Christians. They don't have problems with saints. 1595, Martin Luther, Reformation, we're like, we don't believe in saints, we only pray to Jesus, right? Well, it's a different theological orientation, but when you come from a tradition that has all of these deities to whom you pray, well, it's easy to say, okay, Jesus is top deity among the, right? There's an easy way to connect that. Now, in terms of the movement, if you will, of theology, that is huge. There's a map that I have, and I don't even have all of that in my head. But I say that I wanted to put that on the table to say that there is a real lean understanding, narrow, that, oh, well, everything came from Europe, and went this way. That the direction was from one direction to another, when in fact, those patterns, there was some reciprocity, there was a going back and forth. Then there was going back and forth this way. There's all kinds of directional lines that can be drawn, which makes the ability to pull a thread concretely and say this is the whole thread, it makes it virtually impossible. So there's this confluence of influence, and I hope that makes sense. What is the question about this? Oh, okay. I'm good. Amen. Any other questions? Aaron.
Dr. Weaver, thank you so much. I really appreciated this presentation. I think it's speaking some to Dr. Barbara Holmes.
Yes.
She writes about
Contemplative practices.
And that's my question for you. In your work, did you see contemplative practices? Or would you categorize some of the things you already described as also contemplative? Like maybe the moaning all night. Was that a contemplative practice? How does that also undo some lies or misbeliefs about how African Americans worship today?
Let me deal with the contemplative practice first. There are certainly some that would make the connection between the moaning in terms of the tarrying in some traditions we call it as a contemplative practice. I have come across some narratives that talk about meditation and more contemplative practices. I'm still working with them, trying to mine them and kind of look at them and get some more context, but I have seen that. Second part of your question, how would...
Does that speak to any ideas about contemplativeness in African American religion today?
Okay, African American religion today. Let me preamble my answer to you by saying this, and it's something I talk to Dr. Abington about a lot, is that when one asks a question about African American practices today, I struggle with that question. There are some things it's much better for Dr. Henry Louis Gates to answer. Just, right? I just can't do that. But I will tell you why it's difficult for me, is because I think so ecumenically. When you say contemplative practices, right, immediately I think of Anglo-Catholic Episcopal, that end of the spectrum, right? I also think of, in terms of formal practice to which we associate them, and that there are African Americans in those communities. I also think of Protestant traditions that have contemplative meditative practices but don't use that language, right? I think of Black Quakers, right, who are contemplative traditions. So I can't answer that right, in this very universal way, because it depends on the tradition of the person's formation and the tradition in which they're currently in, right? And so that's something that we liturgically, from a worship perspective, have to really be attentive to in our worship context, is that we have people who are not cradle X. I'm a cradle Presbyterian. They're in the Presbyterian church. But in some places, we've got people who were cradle X and now they're in this tradition. Some people are in their third and fourth tradition, right? So I can't speak to it as a people because it's so varied across traditions, and it is varied within traditions, right? So it depends on the spectrum of traditions. So I want to invite you to think about, to fine-tune that question, and I'm happy to answer it at any time by email. But I hope it makes, I was going to say, I hope it makes sense why I can't answer it. I struggle, because I can't answer, because the Black church is not a monolith. It's not.
Your answer there, though, wasn't the answer to
Okay, then we're on the same page. Right, exactly.
Quaker tradition. I think about African Americans in the Quaker tradition.
Exactly.
So you're answering it as I imagine the practices that.
Sure, okay.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing your body of work with us. My question kind of feeds off of the statement that you just made or the response. How do we, as clergy persons in the educational arenas, how do we avoid or avert the romanticizing of these stories? Because there is a rich element of history. It's artistic, it's poetic, it's all those things, but this is the reality of American history, African American history, the church's history, religious history, and it impacts our spiritual formation, how it's presented. What are your suggestions to avoid or avert the romanticizing, like Hollywood has taken a lot of the stories of the Black experience and made it, oh yeah, that's palatable, or that was cute, or isn't that romantic? How do we do that from this lens, from this perspective?
From within the church?
As those responsible for literature.
Okay, that's helpful. So how do we, I'm going to paraphrase your question for those who may not hear. How do we avoid the romanticization of the history and practices, because we've got all of this Hollywood stuff? How do we avoid that in the church? Two things come to mind. Teaching. Right, we've got to teach people. Liturgy is the work of the people. Liturgia, ergon, right? And we need to teach the people that this is the work of the people, number one. Number two, when I say teaching, I also think it is important that when we teach it, right, that my pastor would say, wear it like a loose garment, right? Because tradition, what is, Jimmy Yaroslav Pelikan, your favorite quote about tradition, right? I can't think of it. I'll have to write it down. But anyway, I'm going to botch this paraphrase up, but I'm going to get to the point, is that tradition should not become an idol. And the romanticization of something is a slippery slope to idolatry, right? And so I think part of the way we do that is to teach people, and to teach people to hold it gingerly, but not too tight that it's an idol, and not loose that it's irreverent, right? And when I say teach, I don't, when pastors here teach, they just fall out. They're like, oh God, that's another 6-week thing I gotta do. No. You can teach in the moment. One of the best pedagogical moments for people who are in a more free church tradition, and it works. If you are in a tradition, I did more teaching when the ushers lifted the offering. I did. While the ushers are lifting an offering, while the ushers are taking an offering, let me tell you why the banners are green today. Amen. While the ushers are lifting an offering, let me tell you why we do this in the funeral rite. Right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to make a 6-week program and then you're going to get mad that people don't come out on Tuesday night to hear you talk about funerals. Then you'll be mad, I spent all this time, they still don't know how to show up at a funeral. Like work smart, not hard. That goes for the church. but also understand from a pedagogical standpoint, because again, one of my former lives as an English teacher, right, teaching all these levels, whatever, that a point of communications theory is that it takes a person 7 to 9 times to finally retain something that they hear. Now let me tell you why pastors are annoyed and want to fall out straight away and give up the ghost. 7 to 9 times. That's just the people here. If we say God is a creative, dynamic God, if we believe that God is sending people, right, that there are new people coming, the people that have heard it for the 3rd time, you got people hearing it for the first time. The people that heard it for the 9th time, you got people hearing it for the first time. So mathematically, what does that mean? It means that you're going to be saying the same thing till you retire from your pastorate, so get over yourself. And use the offering as the 2 minutes that you don't have to wear yourself out trying to come up with a 6-week, 5-point plan on how to lift the offering. Come on here. Right? I mean, we have to think smart and not work smart and not hard. Right? But from a content perspective, I really lean on the idolatry piece. Because folk will get mad if you turn the chair the other way.
Teach now, teach.
They will get mad if you move the plate. They'll get mad if you turn the cup so that you can't see the crack. And you're going to have one mother sitting up in the corner in her chair, and she ain't going to come to the table because you moved the cup. What? But if you teach them that this is a table, and 2 things can be true at the same time. This is an ordinary table. And it is a table like no other table. And so when you hold those in tension, it is not an idol, and it is still holy. I'll tell you a story. Pastor Lloyd told me this, Jimmy. My church in New York and my pastor were known for, if there were any service, it was communion. There was just a way we did communion that some would describe regal, whatever, adjectives notwithstanding. He said to me, Lisa, and there was a way, if my pastor was mad, he would grind his teeth. You see his jaw, grind his teeth. And somebody dropped, or some crumbs fell from the bread. He was just grinding his teeth. He said, and the Lord said to me, it's my table, why are you mad? He said the Lord had to remind him that perfection wasn't the goal, it was faithfulness and love. Right? And so you teach people how to hold things, and that there is grace, and that it is antithetical to say, I can't move the chair, but you believe in the creative and dynamic God that's always moving. If God is always working, God didn't glue the chair to the floor. Right? And so sometimes you have to tutor people into change by just asking them questions and just giving them something to think about. I hope that's helpful. My friend John, I don't know if I can answer the question, but
I hope you can.
I hope so too.
Thank you so much. This is really powerful, and the way you put it together is so inspiring. You gave us a warning. Warning, is that the right word? You gave us a instruction at the beginning to listen for what's missing. And what you just said really brings it to light. That in this exploration of liturgical practices of enslaved peoples, there's no references to the Eucharist, to communion. And I'm wondering if you could speak into that silence.
You mean in terms of the?
Yeah.
Oh, there are some. The curation of narratives for robust learning and mining is such that everything that mentions communion is not worthy of, right, being, it's just like, oh, we had communion and then we drove to, right? We had communion and then we had to work. Part of what my primary goal is to look at the practice and the details of the practice, right? Like I had to confess and I had to confess again, right? And so it's not just the mention. I'm looking for the theology behind it. What do they believe it does, how it works, and how do they practice it? So yeah, oh, I've seen mentions of communion, but there are no details that say how the rite was celebrated or what they believe about the rite. So that would just not be the best use of our time. And I don't. I really don't. I mean, and there's thousands, and that's not hyperbole, literally thousands of more narratives I have to read. I don't think I'm in enough to even posit a reason why. I don't think that would have integrity at this point. I couldn't do that with integrity. No.
Yes, Lisa, I've got a question for you.
I'm like, I think the staff people at CICW know everything, so I'm like surprised.
I actually want to give you an opportunity. Scholarship can be sometimes very dry and laborious, and I want to know if there were any times as you are encountering these narratives, if you were affected emotionally, and if you could tell us about that.
That is a really, really good question because, I mean, for as much as this appears to be like a substantive amount of narratives to look at, my apologies if it were faster than some would have liked, I've had to read lots of hundreds already, right? And yeah, sometimes it has been hard because, the way many narratives are collections are put together, it's everything. And they try to categorize it, but with the raw narratives as opposed to the slave narratives like Douglas, yeah, sometimes there's just ugly brutality, and sometimes I do have to step away. And you can't skip sections because you never know where it is that you'll find the thing. And so, yeah, sometimes some days require more self-care than others. So yes, and thank you for asking that question.